we're doing has an impact. So this is a quote I stole from Alberto Cairo's Twitter yesterday. So we are drowning in information while starving for wisdom. And I think one of the challenges that we face is that journalism in a lot of developing countries, the definition is not necessarily what we consider, independent public service media, can be a very Western idea. So in places where there's not really a history of independent journalism, balanced reporting, you throw data into the mix, and it can get even a little bit fuzzier. So, and I've heard this mentioned a couple times in a couple different contexts. What we really have done to try to figure out how data journalism can have impact in developing countries is, and we've heard this over and over, can we focus on the data that people care about and collected from diverse sources? Because again, there's a lot of trust issues of the government and by extension, the data produced by the government. So many of you work on fantastic civil society initiatives that collect education data, that collect parliamentary data. So people, they say, well, in these countries you work in Afghanistan and Sudan, don't they not have data? Well, everywhere has data now. And there's a lot of money and a lot of resources going into making data available, but there really isn't the data literacy for people to be consuming that media. So first we try to find diversity of data sources, and then something journalists are good at is figuring out stories that people actually want to read. And I think this is where journalism plays kind of a unique role in the data cycle, is because they do know what issues people care about. So really focusing on what society wants to consume and then disseminating that information where they already go for news and information. So what is not impact? And we found this the hard way. Twitter traffic, that's not impact. Having a data journalism workshop with really great Twitter traffic in a country with 2% Twitter penetration.
Remember this at the end of this conference.
Just because it was loud doesn't mean it was good. So that's one thing we've kind of discovered. News apps, maps, dashboards, all this fun digital content in place where people watch TV or listen to the radio. So again, and often these dashboards and things are tweeted and things, but again, if a culture doesn't have, if a society doesn't have a culture of going online to figure out what school they should send their kid to, they're probably not going to go to an app that maps out the best schools in their county, right? That's just not where they get their news and information. So, and again, that comes back to what is not impact, fantastic stories that don't reach the people we want them to reach. So a lot of data we're collecting is to improve development outcomes, to reach development goals, and are often about the poorest people in society, and then we create content that never reaches them. So all of those we're kind of discounting as measurements of impact. Sometimes measurements of impact can be really small. This was a data visualization. It's in Dari. Anybody read Dari here? Created by one of our trainees in Afghanistan. And for us, this was an accomplishment because it was basically the first bar chart we could find in mainstream Afghan media that was actually produced by the journalists. That he understood the data, he decided what was important, and in this case, it was the price of arms before in the run-up to the elections. So basically, you're showing that Afghans were arming themselves, causing a price inflation because of their lack of confidence in the election process. So that's just, so again, I'm not saying these stories have to be revolutionary, but looking at what do we want to see? We want to see, is it increasing public debate? The stories they produce, does it reach our audience, and does it get people talking? And in a lot of these countries, it's not like they don't know there are problems. Corruption is an open secret. So just reporting, look, we have the data showing that 20% of the education budget is being siphoned off. They say, yeah, we know. That's the way government works. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our recipe for identifying the right individuals and donors to embarrass or shame people into actually overcoming their indifference and doing something about the problem. And And then finally, the long-term goal is, again, well, what's our sustainability model? We want the public to consume these kinds of stories and then want more stories based on data. So if people don't consume the stories and then say, well, we want more stories like this, media houses probably won't invest in them, and governments are going to say, well, and we've heard this, we're making a lot of data public and nobody's using it. We've heard NGOs say this, we're collecting a lot of great data, we have it on our website, and nobody's using it. So can we actually get citizens to consume data where they're already used to consuming news and information and want more of that kind of content? So I'm going to give you just a walkthrough of 3 very concrete examples of basically how we kind of tried to deploy this recipe, specifically trying to achieve that kind of impact. So one of our fellows in Kenya, she was a journalist for NTV, and again, this is the print version of her story, but most people consume media in television or radio. So actually, there's a link at the end of this. It was actually a 12-minute news piece that led the nightly news. There was also a print version, but we did measurements, and the impact was actually from the television version. But I wanted you to have a visual. So basically what this journalist did was she looked at Turkana, which is the poorest region of Kenya, and she looked at some environmental data and saw that the droughts were getting more and more close together. So you can see there how often, in which years, they've had droughts. And then she basically looked at, okay, well, how much money are donors sending in emergency food aid every time there's a famine, which was getting more and more often. And basically what she found was the amount of money that USAID spends in 1 year on humanitarian food aid would be enough to scale up little drought reduction strategies, food sustainability programs. I'm talking about digging boreholes and doing drip irrigation. So these sort of these little experiments going on to sort of end the drought program. And she found out if you scaled up those projects to the entire county, you could pay for it in just 1 year of emergency aid from USAID for this one county. So again, the data says that there's kind of an easy solution to this problem. This problem is not a secret. The government knew this. But the government liked getting millions of dollars of humanitarian aid each year. So just alerting to the government to something they already knew, not that effective. What was effective was this family that she covered in the corner. They were featured prominently in her television story. And by the end of the week, Kenyan citizens had sent her over $20,000 in money to feed those specific families. And again, that is exactly the opposite of what the data was saying. The data was saying stop providing emergency food aid and fix the long-term problem. But it did embarrass the government, that all of these citizens were gathering all this money to basically do what the government couldn't do. And then finally, the last piece of the puzzle for this to actually result in impact and policy change was, of course, it was donor funded. So USAID also saw the story and called her up and said, wait a minute, why are we paying for this then? So following the story, it turns out there was actually a draft mitigation strategy in Parliament that had just been shelved because, again, nobody really wanted to risk losing all this humanitarian money that came in every couple of years. So now, after this story, other media copied the story, tracked the issue, and that bill is now front page news. The list of people voting against it is public. And again, this has become an issue that, based on the data, is actually looking like it's going to change. And again, this is the link to the YouTube site, which had much more impact than actually the newspaper story did. So again, that's just one example of sort of a non-controversial data story. So that story can be done in a lot of places because it didn't really depend on naming and shaming anybody. It wasn't super controversial, it didn't get the journalist in danger. This story that was done by another one of our fellows was basically looking at, in Kenya, there's a cash transfer program for the poorest Kenyans. So if you have orphans, if you're elderly, if you're disabled, you get a check every month. And he looked at basically quarterly national budget spending and found out nobody had been paid in 6 months. So since there still were poor people in Kenya, it wasn't like the problem dried up. He's like, well, where did all this money go? And basically what he found was that donors had provided the money for this program based on poverty indicators. So the poorer your county, the more money you got. Members of Parliament decided they didn't like that formula. They were going to put all the money together and divide it by the number of counties. So while they fought about that, nobody had been paid. And this was an important bunch of money to fight about because a lot of it disappears. Looking at the studies, the people who actually received the money, the amount of money was much lower than the money that was actually sent out at the national level. So a lot of the money was disappearing before they froze the system, and then it had been frozen for 6 months. And again, the reason there was such public outrage, Kenyans knew that there were poor people, but he followed around disabled people, he followed around families saying that their community wouldn't help them out because they knew they got cash transfers. So now that those cash transfers stopped, they're basically just broke. And they also found out that they had been using about half the money to reach the post office where these payments were made. So even just going back and forth to the post office was costing them a bunch of money. So again, this had the same kind of shaming effect. It did name the cabinet secretary involved. He called up our editor and said, you need to fire this journalist. And we said, but isn't this your data? And he said, well, okay, so come in and I'll explain it. And he actually over-explained. Like, we had no idea how much was being paid to these ghost recipients. Like, he thought we knew more than we actually did. So we quoted him directly and saying just how much money disappeared. And there was, again, public reaction. There was op-eds about how could this possibly be happening. And actually, the government turned this into a positive opportunity. So they audited and reformed the program, again, in part because donors were saying, wait a minute, you can't change the formula for how you distribute the money, and we want to audit this program. But also then Safaricom, which is a private mobile phone company, they got to step in and say, we'll fix the disappearing money problem by making all the transfers directly for free using M-Pesa. So it eliminated a big corruption problem by mobile money transfers directly to recipients, so money didn't disappear all the way down the chain, and then they had to go back to the old formula for money distribution. And so, again, that one was a little more controversial. You probably couldn't get away with that in some places. In this last example, though, I wanted to just show you because it's, again, kind of a softer approach to incorporating data journalism in developing countries. And actually, someone mentioned this data set in a previous session, was we can map out all the health facilities in a country. We can map out per capita healthcare spending. All that data was publicly available, but nobody had ever really put it into a compelling story. So what our journalist did was he mapped out per capita healthcare spending and then crossed that with data on disease burden. So how much HIV did they have? How much malaria? What was the doctor per population ratio, nurse per population ratio? And then basically the data just led him to a better anecdote. He went to the counties that were spending the least on healthcare and said basically, well, why you have a pretty sick county, why are you spending more money on healthcare? And it turned out it wasn't really a corruption thing. Like, there were over half the counties spent less than they had the year before on healthcare. And that was mostly because they didn't know how to budget. They just copied and pasted the budget from the previous year. So a really nice outcome of this story was governments actually requested help. So our journalist did a follow-up story on doctor absenteeism, and the Open Institute, I don't know if there's anyone from the Open Institute from the room, basically stepped in and said, okay, we'll build a county budget dashboard so that counties can actually compare how they're spending to other counties. Because most of the governments we talked to had absolutely no idea how much they should be spending or how they're spending compared to anybody else's. So now this tool is being rolled out that lets each county, and not just the counties, but the entire public, look and see how this budget is being spent. But again, budget builders exist in a lot of places, and people don't really care about budgets. The reason they cared about this story is because we followed an eye doctor around, and he has 2 million, his 2 counties cover 2 million people, and he's the one ophthalmologist for 2 million people in a place with a preventable eye disease. that usually causes